Today we're going to talk about some of the legal issues as they apply to photography. I should make the following disclaimer that this educational presentation is an overview of some legal concerns for photographers. It is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, by all means, consult with a media attorney licensed in your state, or if you're outside of the USA, legal counsel in your country. Okay, that said, let's see what's happening. So some of the legal issues are understanding your rights as a photographer, avoiding lawsuits and criminal charges, commercial photography contracts and consent forms, copyrights, protections, and infringements. And I'm going to actually put that in a separate video because that's going to take a little while. And then restrictions on cameras in courtroom, especially when courts are in session. So where can I take pictures? Well, from a public place, you can essentially shoot anything that you can see. There's no expectation of privacy when you're in a public place. From a public place, you can shoot onto private property with some exceptions, like sensitive facilities and places that have an expectation of privacy. For example, you can't shoot over somebody's fence. You must honor requests for no photos when you're photographing on private property or into private property. You can photograph accident scenes, bridges and infrastructure, industrial facilities, children, law enforcement officers from a public place. And it's worth noting again that police may not confiscate or demand to view your photos without a warrant. So what's public? Open to the public doesn't necessarily mean public property. Things like malls, movie theaters, casinos, theme parks, museums, those are private property, but they're open to the public. And photos may or may not be permitted unless signs prohibit photography or unless someone in authority objects. If you're not sure if it's truly public or private, check with the property management. Frankly, if it has property management, that's a good sign that you're on private property. You can always ask for permission if it's on private property. If your request is denied, stop taking pictures, or you may risk a lawsuit and a trespassing charge. If you're on private property and your photos are going to be used for any commercial purposes, you need to obtain a signed property release and model release, or again, you may risk some lawsuits. Nobody, including police and private security, may confiscate your cameras or your memory cards or require you to erase your photographs. However, photographers may face charges for taking pictures where it's deemed by law to be a threat to national security. What happens if you're confronted? Well, for openers, be respectful and polite. Try not to escalate the confrontation. Nobody wins in that sense. If the person becomes combative, consider calling the police. Threats, detention, and taking your camera are all grounds for eventual legal or civil actions on your part. So be sure you get the person's name, employer if appropriate, and what legal grounds they claim for their actions. If you don't want to involve the authorities, by all means, go above the person's head to their supervisor or their company's PR department. Bad PR can sometimes influence a company to do the right thing. Contact your local press association or the American Society of Media Photographers for more assistance and guidance if you have problems. There's your rights and there's their rights. While you have a right to take photos in public places, there's not a guarantee that somebody won't file a lawsuit against you, even though it may eventually be dismissed. There's a saying, anybody can sue anybody for anything. Some people are not going to want their picture taken. Even if you're in the right, you may want to respect their wishes and move on to a less disagreeable subject. Lawsuits are civil in nature, and they're filed in civil court rather than criminal court. If you get sued, you may have to pay substantial sums of money, even if the lawsuit is dismissed. Losing a lawsuit means you're going to be on the hook to pay damages and the other side's legal fees. And awards in lawsuits could be small, or they could be very large dollar amounts. And this is a good reason to carry liability insurance to insure yourself against this. Common lawsuits against photographers include invasion of privacy, appropriation, in other words, using someone else's image or their private property to advertise a commercial product, a truthful photo that has a caption or headline that's libelous or puts the subject in false light, or digital manipulations that change the context, content, or meaning of a libelous or defamatory manner. Let's look a little more detail here. Invasion of privacy. Photographers risk lawsuits when they take photos in places where people have a reasonable expectation of privacy and they don't have permission. People have the right to expect privacy in their home, their fenced backyards, or other private property in hospitals, medical situations, and facilities, even including ambulances. And in this day and age, it's worth mentioning that a medical situation might involve something like a COVID-19 test. In addition to the fact people have no expectation of privacy in a public place, there's no expectation even on private property if you're in plain view from a public place like a sidewalk or a street. In other words, if you're on your front porch of your house and that's in plain view of the public street, you're open to be photographed. And the phrase in plain view means you can be seen without using a powerful telephoto lens. So in your backyard, you're probably expecting privacy. Even if the photographer is in the public place, if an unreasonable means are used to take photos where privacy can be expected, the photographer risks losing an invasion of privacy lawsuit. It's also worth mentioning that some states, California comes to mind, have much stricter privacy laws than most of the rest of the states as a result of photographers taking, quote, unreasonable means to take their pictures. When photographing fires or crime scenes, if a law enforcement official or a fire official invites you into the scene, that doesn't necessarily give you a right to enter private property. You need that permission from the resident or from the property owner. Let's look at privacy for a minute. There's no actual right to privacy in the Constitution. That's evolved from years of court decisions. Lawsuits are typically not filed just for taking photos, but when the photos are published or used, that's typically what triggers a lawsuit. Threats of potential lawsuits can arise when subjects are photographed being arrested or in other compromising situations. Appropriation is where you use somebody's image or private property to sell a product or service without consent. You open yourself up to substantial financial damages if you appropriate somebody's image. Compensating models and property owners is a good idea, and photographers should obtain written consent, meaning a model release or a property release. So let's look at releases. There's really three kinds of releases you're going to encounter as a photographer. One is a model release, often called a photo consent. One is a property release, and one is a copyright release, which is really a copyright license. There's examples of all of these on the ASMP site, and I've put a link below, and it'll be in Canvas as well. And it's an important distinction when you're talking about usage is editorial versus commercial photography. Editorial use is things like newspapers, magazines, some websites. Model releases are generally not necessary for an editorial use. You have wide latitude about uses, and permits are not needed in public places. Commercial uses are things like advertising, corporate photography, again, some websites. Model releases are a must. Property releases are a must. And if you're in a public place like a street or a park, most especially things like the national parks, you may need a permit to do a commercial shoot. Model releases are permission to use somebody's image in the photo. That's separate from the permission to take the photo in the first place. It's about usage, not taking the photo. It's generally not needed for editorial use. It's always required for commercial use, and it's not going to stop somebody from suing you. It'll merely slow them down. A property release is permission from the owner of the property to photograph and use that photograph of the property. Property releases include not just buildings and furniture, but also animals. Dogs and cats and pets and horses are all covered under a property release. Again, it's permission to use the photo separate from the permission to take the photo. Generally not needed for editorial use and always required for commercial use And as we said before, it's not going to stop somebody from suing you, but it will slow them down. A copyright release, more accurately, a copyright license, is permission to reproduce your photo. And this is separate from a model or property release, because this is about who owns the image. Is often required by a lab or a publication, a lab either to make prints or a publication to actually reproduce the photo. And it must come from the copyright owner. Typically, that's the photographer if you're in a freelance situation, but it could be your employer if you're a full-time employee. A release footnote, signed releases are not required for news photographers when you're covering news, but some magazines and online sites are starting to require releases out of an abundance of caution. So you should always carry a small packet of release forms with you in your camera bag. Libel is a pictorial image or a verbal statement that's defamatory to one's good name, character, or reputation. If a photograph is truthful to the subject, libel typically doesn't apply. Truth is a defense. Many cases arise when the subject is being arrested or caught in a compromising situation. And if an image is manipulated to be defamatory, then an image may be libelous. Make very certain that the people in your photos are the same ones mentioned in the story, and make sure your captions are accurate. Lawsuits are tried in civil court. Criminal charges are tried in municipal, state, or federal courts for charges like criminal trespassing on private property, disobeying a lawful order, for example, crossing police lines, or participating in riots. The most serious charges can result from reckless endangerment, like impeding traffic on a busy street, or taking photos inside of a nuclear power plant or other government-protected facilities and operations, and very seriously, child pornography. Sentences upon conviction of misdemeanor criminal charges range from probation, public or community service, fines, or even time in the county jail or state or federal prison. So these can be very serious. It's accepted practice in the commercial photography world to avoid conflicts and lawsuits with a written contract. These explain the expectations from both sides, both what the client expects from you and what you expect from the client. This should be a two-way negotiation. Both sides must sign the contract as proof that an agreement was reached, and I do emphasize the agreement was reached. They should include where and when the pictures will be taken. They should probably include why the photos are to be taken, specify whatever usage is involved. Stipulate the recourse if expectations are met by either party. Remember, this is a two-way street. They should be reviewed by a licensed media attorney prior to signing, and they should require consent releases for any recognizable people if it's going to be a commercial use. An assertion of fair use in a copyright situation won't protect you if somebody else's copyrighted photos are used for commercial purposes. The fair use exemption applies if the use is primarily educational, the resulting product is informative rather than creative, whether the original creator benefits from fair use, and how much of the source material is used, small or a greater portion of the original work. Last, let's look at courtroom photography. It's fairly widely allowed these days, but restrictions vary by jurisdiction and sometimes even by trial. It's best to check with the presiding judge or the judge's clerk if you have to cover a specific trial and find out what the specific requirements are. Outside the courthouse is considered a public place, and photography is fine and dandy outside the courthouse. Follow up with the following video.